Hi, today we're talking about fermentation. So in fermentation, we're essentially allowing the process of glycolysis to continue. And if you remember, glycolysis makes a little bit of ATP. Um, you really need oxygen to make a ton of ATP. But if oxygen, for whatever reason, isn't available, fermentation and glycolysis are anaerobic, and which means they don't need oxygen. And this will occur in the cytoplasm. So, for example, um, there is a type of fermentation involving exercise, like a super fast sprint or a burst of energy exerted in humans. The ATP produced from that type of exercise in humans is through lactic acid fermentation. So the pyruvate or pyruvic acid from glycolysis in the presence of NADH produces lactic acid and NAD+. And this molecule here allows for more glycolysis to continue to make just little bits of ATP, little amounts of ATP, no oxygen required. So if you are exercising, very vigorously for a short burst of time, you may have heard of lactic acid buildup in the muscles, and that's what leads to that burn or pain in muscles during exercise. And the only way to get rid of that burn or pain is to stop and to breathe in oxygen. The oxygen actually breaks down the lactic acid. Now, fermentation has its limitations because it only produces a little bit of ATP at a time. Ultimately, cellular respiration, which is not fermentation, is your long-term ATP energy source. It's essentially for endurance purposes and daily life. The marathon concept is that if you're running a marathon, you're 26 miles, 26.2 specifically, the oxygen in and CO2 out needs to be managed so your body can produce enough ATP. Conceptually, the same thing is going on in your day-to-day life. Your body naturally manages how much oxygen needs to come in for the amount of ATP that you need to produce to do the things that your cells are normally expected to do. Another type of fermentation you may be familiar with through foods is alcoholic fermentation. Yeast, bacteria, and molds typically do this type of fermentation. And for humans, this type of fermentation is involved in bread making, cheese making, wine, and beer making. So here we've got conceptually the same thing. You've got pyruvate or pyruvic acid from glycolysis. You have that energy carrying molecule, NADH. The results are alcohol, CO2, and NAD+. And that NAD+ allows glycolysis to continue and make just a little bit of ATP for these, yeast, bacteria, or molds. Now, in terms of foods and human, benefits, the bread making concept with adding yeast and warm water and flour, that process allows for the release of CO2, which leads to that bread rising before it gets baked. And as that bread is baked, the alcohol gets kind of like cooked off, but the CO2 bubbles kind of get captured in the bread, making it kind of squishy or spongy. You can actually, even if you look at bread, see those little like pockets in the bread itself, and that is from CO2 getting trapped in the bread. And that CO2 is released by the yeast in the bread through alcoholic fermentation. Conceptually, things are similar through cheese making, wine, and beer. In terms of wine and beer making, clearly the alcohol product doesn't get cooked off. That's the goal of the process. So again, both types of fermentation, the goal here is to allow glycolysis to continue with no oxygen. So glycolysis, again, makes little amount of ATP, but it does so anaerobically, which means that no oxygen is needed. Thanks.